we'll just let people kind of trickle in as they come in. Suppose before we start in earnest, does anybody have any quick questions they want to kind of like get out of the way before we start? Do 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 do. Okay, doesn't look like we necessarily have any questions. So we'll probably launch in onto our kind of stuff. So today we're just kind of like going. We're having our kind of like bi-weekly workshop on exploring kind of like gender presentation in voice. So lots and lots of people conjure lots and lots of different things when it kind of like um, comes to how people hear gender in voice. You might hear things thrown around like intonation, pitch, uh, prosody, vocal weight, resonance. All of these things do play a role in how people perceive voices. But I think there's probably like varying degrees of how much like each of these influences and sort of how consistently transferable they are between different places. So let's kind of like start off with kind of like conceptualizing how we can split voice training up. Um, I tend to think that there's kind of like three rough groupings of things that happen in voice training. So I think the first of these really is kind of like modifying these like kind of like underlying acoustic things. So like what's our pitch doing? Where's our pitch at? What's resonance doing? What's vocal weight doing? And then other kind of like side acoustic things could play a role in this category. Things like, how much breathiness and all that kind of stuff. But I think we can kind of like fit that into maybe the next category for me, which is probably like stylistic stuff, right? There's lots and lots of different kind of like stylistic impacts or aspects of voice that can play a role in how we sort of experience our voices. So in style, I'm kind of including the kind of combination between things like accent, vibe, and all this kind of stuff. So I'd say it's a pretty wide-reaching sort of concept that we're kind of like weighing in on there. So um, to just recap, it's still more of a thing of how given a control goes up and down through words. Um, To an extent, I think style, I'd probably broadly class as like, um, yeah, I'd say how like a voice fluidly exists in time, right? Like, say,
So, like a voice like this has like low resonance, low pitch, and like slightly higher vocal weight.
whereas, a voice like this has the kind of opposite of that, like a lower vocal weight, higher resonance, a higher pitch, right? But style would be like, how those sounds like exist, right? Because I could speak like a robot,
And I could speak like a robot down here. I could continue to speak like a robot.
and all those kind of factors, right? How they kind of like how voice like presents itself in the real world, right? Um, Rather than just kind of like the linear practice of modifying these variables. And I think, you know, practicing variables underlying are probably like one of the things that like gets the most like immediate gender shift, right? But at the same time, the stylistic stuff is what maybe makes a voice feel kind of like whole or like real or unique, right? And then that kind of brings me on to like maybe the third conceptual kind of like end result or like thing that kind of like plays around in voice training. And I think that's kind of habituation practice, right? Like I could speak here, or I could swap into a voice which somewhat resembles that of Shora or something, right? But my habitual voice use is not Shora's voice, right? Even if I can broadly go into a vibe that is similar to hers, right? My habitual voice is kind of the one I'm using now, right? I'd say that like there's these three kind of like aspects, right? Practicing modifying variables so that we can get our voice sort of where we want it, developing kind of like stylistic features that we like, and kind of like seeing how our voice exists in the world, And the third kind of like aspect of voice training is kind of like developing a voice as our default, right? Seeing if like when we go to speak, if we can make a voice become kind of our default inclination, right? So most of what we're gonna cover today is talking about, how we can start to focus on these like acoustic factors and maybe also start to think about um, the stylistic features and things like that that can play a role and how we might start to work on those as well, but without going into any specifics because obviously different stylistic features are expected in different voices, right? Dependent on context, whether that's like age, whether that's where you live, and all this kind of little stuff. I don't want to make some kind of like overarching judgment on what's typical somewhere for somebody's voice because the truth is that it's not easily defined like that. So let's get started then with kind of like elucidating ourselves a little bit, kind of like really building up for ourselves a little bit of a kind of like mental map of the sort of stuff, I guess, that goes into my brain is loading, can you tell? That goes into like these acoustic kind of features that we were talking about before. So I suppose what I'd like to do is ask people if I say the word pitch, what comes to mind? Can you throw kind of like a little kind of like example sentence in chat or like a definition in chat? Do you think anybody feels up to doing that? Got my nice, not quite cup of tea in front of me. Um, Not quite as in it's not like tea, but like a different type of tea. Um, Understandable. So looks like we have people talking. I'm just typing. I'm just gonna wait to see if there's a response to our question real quick. Um, So the question is, or was, is what is pitch? So we've got an answer. Pitch is the frequency of vibrations of the sound. So that's one way we could kind of describe it. So, but I'm going to expand upon that, right? So pitch is like the human kind of perception going in and listening to a voice, right? It's what we hear when we look at a voice. So
Uh,
it would be a low pitch and would be a pretty high pitch, right? Um, but what we want to be mindful of when we look at any of these sounds is that, human voices, we don't just produce like one kind of like set of frequencies at once. We actually produce that like first note that we hear, right? But also then we produce like a range of kind of like pitches above that note at like one times, two times, three times, four times, blah 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 blah, the frequency. So yeah, I'd say that that could well be M3. More convinced about that kind of like second half there that that was M3. But it's hard to like be certain that one wasn't and one is. The existence of like M3 as a distinct vocal mechanism is a little bit up for debate by some people, but functionally, I think that we describe what it sounds like, and yeah. So back to our kind of like pitch discussion, but I would say pitch is how high or how low we hear a voice, right? So like
so if I was down here, then this would be a low pitch.
would be like a pretty high pitch, and then there's kind of like spaces in the middle, and some of those sounds would be more typical for voices to kind of like habitually hang around. So let's kind of like elucidate some of the other variables. So if I say vocal weight, does anybody have a kind of like description that they feel like sums up vocal weight? So we've got a couple people talking. So we've got one answer, which is forcefulness or buzziness of the voice. We've got another answer is that um, the amount of vocal fold mass that's engaged in vibrating the airstream, and we've got how soft a voice is. So I think all of these definitions make up a part of that. So vocal weight, I'd say, is kind of like how intense, how heavy, how loud, how forceful a voice sounds to us as people, right? Because that's already the metric that matters. It's kind of like how heavy or how light or how loud, how soft a voice is. And you know, people get up in the reeds or up in the weeds about like, oh, is it like one to one with volume? But functionally, as long as we're like not going breathy, as long as we're not changing pitch, um, you know, we're gonna see these changes in we're gonna see a change in this intensity, right? So Aria did touch in on that the amount of like vocal fold mass involved in the vibration affects how kind of like heavy vocal weight is or like how intense a voice sounds. I would say that there's like a few more variables that kind of like get in on the bandwagon as to like how we hear vocal weight. But a large proportion of it does come from the amount of kind of like vocal fold engagement coming into the sound. So, or like the degree, the thickness, the kind of like yeah, the amount of vocal folds getting involved with the vibration plays a large part in how we hear vocal weight. So let's just kind of like listen out for vocal weight real quick. So if I go from like a softer, lower vocal weight sound to an increasing and then back to a softer, lower vocal weight, that might sound like right? So we went from a kind of like light vocal weight, low vocal weight to a heavier vocal weight. You know, mostly keeping pitch in the same place. For each of those sounds, there was a little bit of wiggle on each of them, but you know, broadly in the same place. So that's something to keep in mind. As long as we're keeping pitch in the same place, as long as we're not going breathy when we try to go soft, we're probably going to be keeping going for like the right metric there. If we like focus on volume, we can kind of use volume as an indicator of what's going on. So just look out for breathiness, look out for pitch change, and if we're changing volume, we're basically changing vocal weight. That's as much as we really need to know, but look out for also kind of like sounds of roughness or turbulence when we go down to softer sounds as well, because that can trip us up as well. So let's sort of jump on to the next sort of topic, right? So we identified vocal weight, pitch, as kind of like important fundamental acoustic like things to look out for in our voices. Does anybody have a rough definition for resonance at all? Or if not, because it can be hard to define, I will launch into a little bit of a discussion real quick. So we've got one answer that's resonance is affected by how big a chamber is that a sound is like housed within. Um, we've got somebody else typing an answer as well, so I'll just see what comes up. So the next answer talks about harmonics and like parts of the sound which are kind of like highlighted as compared to the rest of the sound. We want to be careful just with this definition because what we're probably describing is formants. Formants are kind of like applied resonance, i.e., resonance exists even if there's no sound, but formants are what arise from the effect of resonance existing and sounds being played into it, which seems like a bit of a niche kind of like determining thing to highlight, but it is relevant to just kind of like be aware. So when I think of resonance, there's kind of like three things that can change the resonance or the properties of resonance in a chamber, in a material, all this kind of stuff. So that's like the shape, the size, and the material. So we're not changing the materials that our throat are made out of, so we can kind of like ignore that one for this case. We've got size and shape. So these kind of come in together. So you know, the voice is made up of lots and lots and lots of resonances, so frequencies that stand out as compared to the rest of the sounds, or are more sustained within a space as compared to the rest of the sounds in there, or the rest of the noise, I guess, in there. So, just gonna take a sip of some more of my tea. We've got so these kind of like frequencies that are more likely to stand out. So what we can generally think about when it comes to voices, are these frequencies lower because the space is bigger, right? Or are they smaller because the size is smaller? The frequencies that are standing out lower or higher, right? I think the thing we want to be really careful about when we think about resonance is that it's the ratio between these frequencies that stand out that matters for like how we hear sounds. So when we're kind of like going from like, a low resonance, a big space, to kind of like a higher resonance, a smaller space, we want to keep all of these things in proportion, right? And how we do that is by focusing on the sound and making sure that we're not swapping between vowels accidentally, right? If we deliberately choose to do something because we're doing it in a focused way and we want to focus on that aspect, that's all well and good. But we don't want to accidentally fall into the trap of like, oh, I'm going to change my resonance. And then what you see happening is people disproportionately maybe shrink mouth space, and we kind of end up with a voice that sounds a little bit off, maybe with some of the vowels shifting towards the wrong sounds, or just not being as kind of like bright, I guess, or high in resonance as we want. Want to be careful with the word bright, just because some people, use it to describe different things. So I'm going to kind of like etch that word out of our mind for a second. But these three variables, vocal weight, resonance, pitch, they are kind of like the underlying acoustic things that may play a role in how we hear a voice. So broadly speaking, I would say that vocal weight and resonance are the two most important variables for how people hear gender and voice. However, and the interaction between the two. However, pitch is still relevant, but I think it's a bit more of a vibe thing, right? So a voice like this might sound masculine, but it's really atypical, and I don't think I've ever heard a guy that like speaks like this, right? And at the same time,
Well, voices like this are also somewhat atypical. They sound like old people, and things like that, right?
but and you might still perceive that as feminine because the resonance is high, the vocal weight's a little bit higher than we might typically expect, but that's probably the overall vocal mix coming into play there. But we want to be mindful that we are kind of like, we're thinking about the ways these variables interact with each other to like produce a vibe together, not kind of like taking them on their own and being like, oh, I gotta push that one to the sky and that one to the sky and that one to the sky. We want to remember that all of these things exist together, and if we like hyper focus on one variable, we might be letting the rest of the mix down. We might be accidentally sort of, neglecting the overall kind of like sound qualities we're getting to in pursuit of like just gunning one all the way to the top. And if you want to explore extremes, that's fine. But we want to be mindful that, gunning things to the extreme might not always be the thing that we want to do if we want to like go for a specific vibe or quality in our voices. So now that we've kind of like talked about those variables a little bit, let's just sort of see what some of these variables interacting together might sound like. I'm just going to focus on vocal weight and resonance to begin with here. So I'm going to choose a relatively low vocal weight, and I'm just going to scale some sounds up and down in terms of resonance, kind of an androgynous pitch. Oh, right, and we can kind of hear maybe that it kind of like moves through a point where it kind of like changes gender presentation there. Bow, 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 bow. Right. That is the effect of resonance changing on a kind of like low vocal weight at honestly actually a pretty high pitch. Let's see what changing resonance sounds like down at a lower pitch. Uh maybe with a heavier weight to begin with. Right? And it's a little bit more rough down there as well, just kind of like because of the combinations that are coming in there, but we can still hear the effect of resonance changing. It just sounds quite different, dependent on the vocal mix. Let's try higher up as well. Right? We might still hear a bit of a gender change, but it's definitely not the most typical sounds when we're kind of like heavy up high either. So maybe what we want to kind of like think about is the kind of relationship between these sounds, right? Maybe if we just kind of borrow from Ziana's model for a second, sounds that are kind of like low resonance and low vocal weight.
So, something like this, or, even something more like this. We could maybe describe these sounds as hollow, like there's not that much sort of stuff going on in there, right? It's like
when we've got big space, low resonance, soft sounds, it might sound a little bit kind of like there's something missing.
So we're here and then we get heavier, right? This might sound more typical, might still sound a little bit weird.
If I raise my resonance up when I'm down here, right, it sounds like maybe overfull, right? Might be the phrase to go for. Kind of like, oh damn, that voice is like really kind of like buzzy or heavy or bright.
Right? And the same is true if we kind of carry up high vocal weight, up at high pitches as well.
Yeah, so like this voice might also sound
like, it's a little bit like more energetic, bright than we might expect, right? So we can start thinking about the relationship between these two. I think there might be one combination that I didn't really showcase that much. So that would be kind of like,
a kind of like high resonance but with like a relatively like lower pitch. So these voices are pretty kind of like uncommon.
Just because they tend to be a little bit harder to kind of like keep sustained and keep clean. Maybe somewhere in the middle of those voices would be a voice like so one voice that I like, which might somehow fit into that gap, is Tanya Reynolds' voice from Sex Education on Netflix, and hopefully this should come through.
Day on the job. I literally found out I got the job like 3 days before, and then
sweet.
I was there doing that scene, getting my boobs out for shooty, and it was just so much fun, and I just loved it. Hi.
So something about Tanya's voice is that the vocal weight isn't like all that low either, but the pitch is definitely very low. But despite that, the resonance is very high. So, the relationships between all these variables can vary a little bit dependent on exactly where we are in our range or what we kind of expect at different points in our range. So I think the key takeaway is that, broadly more feminine voices tend to have, resonance higher, vocal weight lower, and pitch higher. And the same is reverse. The reverse is true for more masculine voices. But these are just trends. And, different voices aren't always going to fit that very specific mold. And it's kind of like a combination between these acoustic things going on and the kind of like stylistic features going on that kind of determine what's natural for a voice, right? So let's kind of like jump forward a little bit to talking a little bit maybe about some of the stylistic stuff that we can focus in on, or rather how we can start to think about working on stylistic things. So recently, on Skillshare, I've been watching very slowly this kind of like voice actors kind of like guide to voice acting and the way that he sort of gets into the roles of these kind of like voices. And once I look past the glaring misunderstandings about how acoustics works, I could actually tolerate it. And I think it actually had some pretty good advice, which really does play a role, sort of when style comes into play. So what we sort of like might want to do is start collecting a playlist of different voices that we like, right? These don't have to be, I want this voice, exactly this voice, only this voice, right? We want to be like more, you know, not that selective. We want to be able to kind of like pick up voices, right, that we do like, and see if we can like expand that pool a little bit, or at the very least listen to the samples of those voices more often, right? See if we can do a little bit of passive and active listening, right? Passive listening might be like listening to those voices in the background, right? Might be like, you know, doing all that kind of stuff. More broadly, just listening to a lot of kind of like feminine voices if we are kind of like working in that direction, or more masculine voices if we're working in that direction, right? And start to kind of like absorb the stuff going on. And then more active kind of focused stuff might be like paying attention to the way they say things, right? Do they do any kind of like inflections at any point? Do they have like any weird quirks going on in the voices, right? Do they have like any mispronunciations or anything like that, right? Really sort of like picking up like some of these features. So over the weekend, I made a couple of playlists of just some voices that stood out to me that I liked. And, you know, these don't have to be like the most focused ever. In fact, this is a pretty wide range of voices. I don't know if that's actually going to send the playlist. Let me see if I can grab the playlist actually. There we go. That link might be better. So in there is like a collection of some voices that different people might like. They're not like the widest range ever, right? But it's kind of like look out for different voices that you find interesting, that you like listening to, and bonus points for like voices that we might like to pick up ourselves. But just see if we can like pay some more active attention to the voices we're listening to. Never really hurts, right? So so Maudleaf left. I'm so bad about this. I haven't kept a target voice for more than a week. That's absolutely fine. I think the thing that comes to mind though, if we're going to explore lots and lots of target voices, right? Spend a bit of time just kind of like playing around with like mimicking stylistic aspects of them, right? We don't have to like nail down a voice exactly, but the more we can get used to like exploring even voices that we don't want to end up exactly as, even if it doesn't like last for a while, right? That our kind of like attachment to a specific voice, right? Playing around with mimicking, focusing in on like features of that voice will make us better at kind of like paying attention to voices that we kind of like look at in the future, right? So we want to really start thinking about like what things do we like about a voice and what can we pick up, right? So you can kind of like subtly mix up your vibe in ways by like focusing on aspects of voices. Like, say if I'm thinking of this voice, and don't get me wrong, it's vintage, right? I could continue to speak like with that vibe going on, and I could keep it going, even if like it's not, you know, the most accurate way to how I'd usually speak. You can tell that like this isn't like, you know, how I'd normally speak, right? You still have that sort of vibe going on, right? We can start kind of like paying attention to the vibe, seeing if we can keep it going, right? And like with something like the vibe, right, we can start playing around with acoustic factors on the side if we want to, right? So, and if I was like doing that with a specific voice, say that same like sentence or something, and don't get me wrong, it's vintage, right? I could try mixing up that vibe. I could try mixing up the kind of like acoustic parameters underlying it. And don't get me wrong, it's vintage. Don't get me wrong, it's vintage, right? I could try mixing them up a little bit and kind of like seeing where it ends up. And don't get me wrong, it's vintage. Right? I can mix things up and like play around with it. That might not be the best example because it's pretty stylized, but we can sort of like, you know, explore these things. So you've been afraid of doing that kind of mimicry because you're worried it make you super dysphoric. Dysphoria is definitely something that does weigh in on us a little bit when we kind of like make choices, when we kind of explore different sounds. I think we can't always control whether we're going to feel dysphoric about something, but we can start to see if we can kind of like modify our response to it, right? I think one of the best things we can do when kind of like playing with mimicry and things like that is not get too caught up in like how well we exactly mimic something, right? We want to like see if we can kind of like pay attention, right? To what's going on in those sounds, and really kind of like have a go at doing it, but we can maybe save judgment for later, right? We can sort of like avoid really laying on judgment. And if we do find that we're getting into a like judgy place, like, oh, I don't think that was right, maybe we can kind of like take a step back, maybe work in some positive affirmations, right? See if we can kind of like remind ourselves that voices are actually capable of like a huge range of different sounds. So if we're like not like 100% on one of these sounds, then maybe we can explore some of these other sounds, right? Yeah, we're not necessarily trying to perfectly nail down a voice, because what we want to do is explore around those voices. We want to explore qualities from voices. And, you know, if we want to, we can really focus in on getting a one-to-one. But that kind of like sound-alike practice is the kind of thing that voice actors spend like weeks playing around with a voice for, right? You know, yeah, and like cassette tape said, people's voices aren't normally like 100% like the same all the time. So let's jump back to what Lily said in chat before. So Lily said, my big issue is I don't know what to say, like words, and I really like the words, and I really stress about it. So I think this is like something that like can be a little bit tricky. But it's something we can also work around. I think one of the best ways of doing it is almost role playing in our heads, right? Like so we can kind of set the scene, right? If I was going to the bakery or the library, right? And I was like wearing these clothes, or this person was wearing these clothes, if they were like, what sort of vibe do they have? Are they tired? Are they awake and like happy? Are they like all these kind of things? And think about like the ways that like a character or a person in those scenarios might react to those things. And then like, what would you say in those scenarios? Really kind of like flesh out the situation and start to like think about, that's a scenario that could exist in my everyday life, right? And what sort of thing, like, what would they say, or what would I say, right? Like, the words that I choose to say when I'm talking in my own voice, versus the words that I may choose to use as I explore a voice like Shora's voice, may actually be slightly different. So if I was Shora, what sounds would I prioritize? Or what words would I maybe say more? Or what words would I be more likely to say? Right? Things like that, right? We might kind of like really explore those kind of things, right? Really start to think in that sort of mindset. And we can do the same thing when we're kind of like thinking of our own voices, right? So if we're working on kind of like, I've identified a vibe I want to go for, we can start to work on a skill called audiation. I don't know if you all have played around with audiation before, or even know what it is. Chances are you've played around with it before, but maybe didn't really know what it is. So audiation is like imagining sounds. So if you're like listening to music, or like you're thinking back to a piece of music and kind of like listening to it back in your head, that's audiation. And we can start to do the same thing, or the same sort of thing, with voices. So part of what that could be is like imagining this role play scenario, really fleshing out everything going on in the environment. But that could also be like kind of like thinking of words to say and then practicing saying them in our own voices, seeing where we kind of like end up, how we do that kind of thing. And just start thinking around like how we might navigate situations with the voice that we want to end up with. And we can start kind of like seeing if we can almost mimic sounds from the kind of like thoughts we conjure in our heads, right? And we can start to like practice in that way as well. Audiation is also something you can do silently. So it can really help you like practice or focus in on the sort of vibes you want to go for without necessarily like using voice, if that's something that's like not something we can do right now. So let me just like read what Aria said there. So I think it would help if I got bass vocal config from Witch Mimicry, which doesn't sound awkward at least. It was never about being discouraged due to hyperfixation to me. It was really about being uncomfortable to hear if I wasn't doing to a sufficiently different configuration from my original voice at the same time. So that kind of like comes from a little bit of our approach, I think. So one thing that we could do maybe, okay, because I'll keep that in mind. One thing that we could kind of like start to think about or start to do is kind of like work on God, my brain just froze. We could start to kind of like think about how we're going for these things, right? So mimicry and like focusing on it like that might be something that we don't want to like lead in with initially, right? We might want to like focus on some of the more like underlying control aspects first, and then jump to mimicry a little bit later on when we feel more confident in that. Still, you know, mulling away, collecting voices that we like, doing this kind of stuff, but maybe saving the mimicry for a bit later until we've felt that we've got a little bit more control of the kind of like core underlying fundamental elements, things like vocal weight, resonance, and pitch. And you know, there are other little aspects that can play a role in how a voice sounds, like you know, the degree of kind of like tongue root retraction in a voice, or like lots of little different things. But we don't necessarily need to like hyper focus on that stuff, I guess. But for that kind of stuff, the more kind of like general exploration and mimicry we can do, just kind of like having fun with like our voices and different sounds that we're kind of like playing with, that is one way that we can start to build up a little bit of a library, a repertoire of the sounds that we're going for. So to get me back on point, I think that was actually still on point, but we can sort of like, I want to jump to that in a second, but or maybe I'll jump to that now because it's what's in my head. But what we might want to do is like think about how we're practicing this underlying acoustic stuff, right? I think one of the troubles that people have is that they kind of like, instead of focusing on controlling acoustics or acoustic parameters, they sort of like think, what is the thing I can do to like get to like closest to this other voice I'm going for, right? Without almost like, without really kind of like developing an understanding of like how to modify the variables. So, you know, speech practice, like recording, listening back and all that kind of stuff is a valuable way of practicing. But I also think that there's a lot of value in just practicing modifying variables on like single tiny sounds or words alone. Like, you know, if I was like making bub, bub, bub sounds, right? Like I could change a lot of the vibe of that sound just by like changing things a little bit. So bub, 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 bub. Bob, 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 bob. Right, and I was getting a little bit kind of like turbulent at the end there. But practicing kind of like moving through gradients of these sort of sounds is also a way that we can start to like feel maybe a little bit more in control. That kind of like bub sound that I did there, completely randomly chose. You could do lots and lots of different sounds. Sorry, my voice isn't 100% clean right now. But oof, I'm sorry to hear that, Aria. This bit of the workshop will be recorded anyway, so you can look back over that later if that becomes a problem. But we do kind of like want to also practice kind of like modifying variables and really focusing in on seeing if we can control them, because, and on a range of different sounds as well, right? While keeping stuff or like pseudo isolating things, right? If we change weight, we want to be able to know that we can keep pitch in the same place and resonance in the same place as we do it, right? Oops, there was a little bit of moment in there where it went a little bit wonky. But we can start to kind of like practice these sort of gradients and things, and really focusing in on like modifying these variables in a controlled way is important. And I think something we want to remember, that when we do any exercise in voice, there's a reason we're doing it, and it's probably related to controlling these three kind of like fundamental variables in some way, right? If we're doing an exploratory exercise, it's probably to like explore and find a new configuration. If we're doing something like a resonance exercise, what we're doing is practicing kind of like scaling resonance up, but in a less kind of like focused way than if we were to do it during voice, right? As we play with all of these things, we want to remind ourselves that exercises are there to help us find configurations. If we can find a configuration, maybe we want to see if we can do the same sort of modification without relying on the exercise to get there, because exercises are like crutches. They're great if we need them at the time, but we don't want to become reliant on them, because at that point, it really does start to be a hassle, right? It starts to weigh us back, it starts to hold us back. So I know that I kind of like spoke for a long time there, but does anybody have any questions about the stuff that we sort of covered so far? Do do do. That is aggressive marketing from that human. Oh damn, it's in everywhere. All right. I do hope that it's at least relevant. In my normal speaking style and tone, I've noticed a tendency to get shouty and overbearing that's completely unintentional, probably caused by my ADHD or autism. But it makes me punch the words for emphasis when I don't intend to, right? So that happens, right? But how, so is that something that you are working to kind of like work on or like focus in on? Okay, so it can be a little bit tricky when things are unintentional, but I think one of the most important things to do is maybe like focus in on like listening to ourselves as we speak, like build up a kind of pattern of listening back to how we're speaking and see if we can identify when it happens. The first step of kind of like modifying any behavior is noticing when it becomes a thing. Like you might notice that I say like a lot or a lot. These things are like not the best, but they're not something that's caused me like such a kind of like moment that I've gone out of my way to kind of like fix them. However, the first thing that I would want to do is kind of like notice when they're coming in, because like when I did that, that was a little bit intentional, but that kind of like thing is something that I wouldn't really necessarily like notice all by itself. So noticing and then replacing with a different behavior might be something that you want to do. So, if you notice that when you kind of like get for emphasis, maybe you can get into the habit of like, instead of like increasing the kind of like, intensity of them, right? So if I was just to go through that sentence, it makes me punch the words for emphasis and I don't intend to, right? We might change that up with like, but it makes me punch the words
punch the words for emphasis when I don't intend to, right? We might try and replace it with like maybe going up in pitch on those sounds, and that kind of thing, right? So maybe not the cleanest kind of execution of that concept, but we could start to practice that kind of thing and see if we can replace the habit with one that's, maybe not ideal, but more sort of like in our goals and more in our direction of like wanting to do stuff. It's less of a kind of like, fixing the problem completely kind of thing, I think, and more of a kind of like, reallocating or redirecting the kind of like energy in some way. So Maudley said, any advice on habitualizing or habituating? I've been working on a particular voice for a while, but it still takes a lot of effort to keep up. And the second I get distracted, it starts to fall apart a bit. Pitch drops, lots of fry enters, it refuses to stick, and I can't drill it in the middle of the meeting. So, Maudley, couple of questions. When you say it's hard to keep up, is it like comfortable to keep up? Like, do you have any issues with like maintaining it due to discomfort or anything like that? That's probably the first question that comes to mind for me, just to make sure that we're kind of like, in a configuration that feels comfortable for us to get to, because that's definitely something that can cause us to drift a little bit. Yeah, so it's more of a discomfort kind of thing. All right. So if it was a case of like, you're dropping it because it's like just like hard to remember to stay up there, I would say that that's the sort of case where you really want to maybe focus in on like finding words that you say a lot, right? And really kind of like practice making sure that they're exactly in the like place you want them. So like if I were to say like a lot, which I do, right? Maybe I could kind of like practice like really focusing on the word like, right? So like I could make sure that that was kind of an anchor word. So if I started to drop down, like I could fix it by jumping back to that sort of like anchor words and like really knowing that I can kind of like nail it when I go for it. Really like focus in on consistency, on like anchor words or like words that we say a lot, which we know we say a lot, so we can sort of like use those to prompt us back to where we want to be. But if it's a sort of like uncomfortable to maintain sort of voice, where we really want to work is probably on the consistency angle or the kind of comfort in accessing angle. So my suggestion here would be like to explore getting into that configuration and see if we can make it more comfortable, right? Do we notice any kind of like muscle fatigue? Do we like do we notice any muscle fatigue? Do we notice any sort of like turbulent sort of like vocal fold behaviors that lead to kind of like fatigue or like tiredness vocally? And really see if we can kind of like work around those behaviors to find more comfortable ways of getting to the same sort of sounds. Certain sounds, will have an inherent degree of sort of discomfort associated with them. So if I were to speak in a voice like this for the whole day, well, yes, I might find that my voice is fatigued. Very fatigued, in fact. After playing around with Shore's voice, I often find that I actually can't go to like super high kind of like, right? Less consistent than it was earlier, right? And things like that can weigh in on our ability to access different sounds and like keep them consistently. But unless there's like a really, really intense bit of like constriction in the voice that we do like, so, I don't really think that for most people, short of like muscle weakness, generally speaking, strength is that big of an aspect. I think it's probably a case of like maybe playing around with like seeing if we can, use something like external noise, lots and lots of different prompts, maybe scaling resonance up and down, and really focus on like finding ways of getting to that same configuration with maybe a little bit less like tension. It might be all right, it might be okay. If it's like
you know, not that much tension. It may well be a case of like, you know, as I said before, like playing around with some of these anchor word kind of like things, really focusing on like working in that sort of way, and like focusing in like that. So, you know, really kind of like exploring in that way is like maybe the way I'd go. See if you can make it easier. Don't kind of like write off that sort of practice, but try and like mix it maybe with a bit of both and see if you can like use that to like find something that's more sustainable or find ways of like keeping it sustained over time. The other kind of thing might be like exploring with like audiation, as we kind of mentioned before, and like you know, say if I'm going for like a voice, right? Like I can conjure the kind of like vocal quality from memory. If I'm kind of like thinking of Shora's voice,
well, maybe I could audiate a sentence before I go into it to explore and see if I can remember what sort of sound I'm going for.
right? And kind of like explore like that, right? Because when I jump to a voice like that, or a voice like, he's dangerous to you now, do you understand? Right? I haven't really gone to the effort of like making an anchor phrase for that or like anything like that, right? Or not an anchor phrase, but like making a kind of like playing around with habituating that sort of quality or anything. But if I'm going for a quality, maybe something I can do, and I'm consistently going for the same quality, is kind of like practice audiating maybe a sentence, and then like if it makes sense to like use that sentence or use that sort of vibe, right? Then maybe we could have a go at kind of like mimicking that as we go to speak. You know, there is something to be said about like the degree of mental processing power you have. So like maybe a short sound, uh like an sound that you could maybe throw in at the start of kind of like speech or something like that. Or like, yeah, so blah 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 blah, right? We could kind of like build up in that sort of way. Did anyone else have any other questions that are kind of like related to this stuff? Or like, you know, any other stuff, of course. All right. So I think what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to stop the recording here for now on this bit.